Hello, all the nerds out there. I hope you all are doing fine and actually preparing for the upcoming exam. Still, we are waiting for the final answer key, right? But it will be soon released. Maybe today, this evening, or maybe tomorrow. Anyway, in a couple of days, the final keys will be there, and I guess most of you will pass. I hope. So today we are here for our again the series that I talked about, that most 100 expected topics in net English, and this is the second lecture, and also we are going to cover English in India, history, evolution and future. So I hope all of you are excited. So before that, I would like to welcome you to this channel, Nerd School, and before we jump into the section, I would like everybody to subscribe the channel and also write the comment, or write hi at least in the chat box, so I know how many of you are there. So it's a live class and it will be uploaded in YouTube soon, but today whoever is there, just write hi in the chat box. So we'll begin. All right, let's start. Okay, so let's talk about how the European showed up in India. Picture this: back in the day when India was minding its own business, the Europeans decided to drop by for a visit. And it all started with those adventurous explorers like Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus. They were sailing around trying to find new trade routes and all this stuff. And guess what? They stumbled upon our India, right? And they couldn't resist its riches and spices. So these Europeans, especially starting with Portuguese, then Dutch, British, and French, they started setting up shops in different parts of India. They built trading posts, forts, and of course ports along the coast, and they wanted to get their hands on all those valuable spices that we have, all the textile that we have, and other goodies that India had to offer. And let me tell you, these things got pretty intense because the Europeans were competing with each other to gain control and monopolize the trade. They even fought wars amongst themselves, using the local rulers as pawn in their game. Isn't it a little bit frustrating? But by the way, eventually the British East India Company came out on top. They were like, hey India, we are here to stay. Not for like 10 or 20 years, but hundreds of years. So they gradually expanded their influence and started ruling over large part of the countries. So the British Raj, they called it, right? That's how we know. But it wasn't just the British who had a piece of the pie. The other European powers had their own territories too. The French had some colonies, the Portuguese had their own slice, and the Dutch were hanging around as well. So that's the story, how the European barged into India. They came, they traded, they fought, and some of them even ended up ruling the place. And it was a quite wild ride, I guess. So that is all, little bit introduction, and now we'll move to the introduction of this unit that we have and what we are going to study. And remember, 1 or 2 questions comes from that. This history, evolution and future, right? So let's see the introduction. And as you can see over your screen, that all the points are there, and I'm gonna talk about each point one by one, like I always do, right? So if you are pretty excited and interested, come on, again, like the video. But anyway, let's go. And any question you have, you can just write this in the chat box and I'll just reply immediately. Okay? So let me give you the scoop on how the British East India Company became a big deal in India. So I would like you to picture this. These British folks were all about the trading game. They wanted a piece of India's action. So they set up this company called the British East India Company. So these guys were serious about making money, and they started building trading posts, forts along the Indian coast, right? So they were like, again, hey India, we are here to trade. And maybe a little more, right? So as time went on, they got more powerful and started expanding their influence, and they even got involved in local politics, playing some real life kind of Game of Thrones. And before you knew it, they were calling the shots and ruling over a large part of the country. And it was like the British East India Company was the boss of India. Right? I'm taking you all the way back there. Imagine that you're there and what things are going to happen. But anyway, let's dive into the era of British India. So spanning from 1600 to 1947, right? So again, picture this. The British came rolling into India like they owned the place. It all started with East India Company setting up shop in 1600, and they were all about that trade and making them serious, things. And over time, they went from trading buddies to what they eventually became what? The rulers. And the British Raj, as they called it, took charge and started calling the shots. They were like, hey India, we are going to stay, and we are going to stay for a long time. So they ruled the show until 1947. So it was a long ride filled with ups and downs, battles, and of course a whole lot of tea. But it wasn't just the British had all the fun. Other Europeans powers like the French, Portuguese, and Dutch had their own little piece of Indian pie too, and it was a wild time. And let me break it down to you. So we had these Europeans, right, hanging around in India for a pretty long time. And you can just 1612 to 1947. So how many years are there? Right in the chat box. So first up, between 1612 and 1757, we had the East India Company doing its thing, right? And they set up these trading posts called factories in different parts of India, mostly along the coast. So the Mughal emperors, who were the Maratha Empire, everybody is aware of it, right? If yes, write in the chat box and I'll know. But anyway, these local rulers were like, yeah, sure, you can stay, but they didn't know that they are going to stay for a very long time. Come on, fools, you should have thought about it. But anyway, the East India Company had some competition too, with trading companies from Portugal, Denmark, and the Netherlands, and also France in the mix. So by the mid 18th centuries, cities like Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta were getting pretty big. So then came the company rule era, which starts from 1757 to 1858. The East India Company started gaining more control over large parts of India, which they called presidency. But here's the truth, they were also coming under the watchful eye of the British government. So they were kind of sharing power with the crown. And by the way, the company was losing its fancy trading privilege during this time. So now let's talk about what happened after the Indian Rebellion of 1857. So the company's powers were like, nah, we are done. And they've passed everything over the crown. And that's when the British Raj era began, from 1858 to 1947. They started expanding the administrative boundaries and even added places like Upper Burma into the mix. The old presidency were getting a bit messy, so they broke them up into smaller provinces to make things more manageable, right? So check this out. In 1608, the English East India Company got the green light from the Mughal authority to set up a tiny trading settlement in place called Surat, which is Gujarat now, right? And it was like their first headquarters or something. And then in 1611, they decided to get serious and open a permanent factory in Machilipatnam and on the Coromandel coast. And you know what? They jumped on the bandwagon with other European trading companies and started doing business in Bengal too. But here's the thing, those Mughals who were in charge, their power started fading away, from 1707. First the Maratha got in the way, then Persia swooped in 1739, and Afghanistan decided to join the party in 1761. So it was real mess. But guess what? Saved the day for the East India Company, right? Victories at the Battle of Plassey and in 1757 and the Battle of Buxar in 1764. And this battle went down in the Bengal presidency, which was established in 1765. And just to the top of it, they abolished local ruler Nijamat in Bengal in 1793. So that is the introduction, how India came into, how Britain and that East India Company ended up in India. And that's what very important it is before we jump into the what was a major event, and that actually set the tone of our whole lecture, right? And now we'll talk about some major event, and we have these two battles which are very important: Battle of Plassey and also Battle of Buxar in 1764. So let's talk about, we'll just give a little bit talk about, and then we'll move to our major points, right? So let's talk about first the Battle of Plassey, and it went down on June 23, 1757, and it was a major win for British East India Company. They were up against the Nawab of Bengal and his French buddies, of course. And leading the charge was this dude named Robert Clive. And man, did he make things happen. Here's the crazy part. The British won because this guy called Mir Zafar decided to switch side. This thing, no. But anyway, he was the commander-in-chief for Nawab Siraj-ud-Dawla. But he was like, nah, I'm out. At the crucial time, how this guy just, betrayed his own. So his betrayal totally helped the British East India Company to take over Bengal. And let me tell you, that victory was a game changer and paved the way for British East India Company to start taking control of other parts of India. And they didn't stop at Bengal. Over the next 100 years, you can guess what? They went on conquering, all the places and grabbed hold of most of the Indian subcontinent, even Burma. So that's the Battle of Plassey. Now we'll move to the Battle of Buxar, right? So there was this epic clash, this called the Battle of Buxar. And that went down on October 22 to 23, 1764. On one side, you had that British East India Company, okay, and it is led by a dude named Hector Munro. And on the other side, teaming up against the Brits were Mir Qasim, the Nawab of Bengal, and the Nawab of Awadh, Shah-ud-Dawla, right? And even the Mughal emperor himself, Shah Alam II. And it all went down in Buxar. So this super fortified town in Bihar, right on the banks of the Ganga river, about 130 kilometers west of Patna. So let me tell you, it wasn't just a walk in the park for the British East India. It was a tough battle. But guess what? They managed to pull off a victory. Quite an impressive, right? But anyway, after all the fighting and whatnot, they decided to call it a day and settle things with the Treaty of Allahabad in 1765. That was their way of saying, okay, we are done here. So that's how the Battle of Buxar played out, and major showdown with the Brits coming out on a top and sealing the deal with the treaty. So that is major event that we discussed, and now we'll move to the rise of the English language in India. So before any language take part in India, we had to know that about the speaker, right? So that's why we had to a little bit talk about the introduction, how British came and all this. Everybody knows about it, just to brush up your memory. And now we'll move to the rise of the English language. Are you ready, guys? So it is also another introduction how English language in India came. So let me tell you about how English made its way into India. It's quite an interesting story. So back in the day, when the British were ruling India, they needed a way to communicate with the locals, right? They already had their own language, English, and which they wanted to use as a medium of communication. So now, at first, English was mainly used by British officials and traders. They would use it to interact with the Indian population, particularly in administrative and commercial contexts. So over time, the British realized that English could serve as a common language for different linguistic group in India, because as a country, as an India, it was like incredibly diverse with numerous languages and dialects, and still it is there. So what is the common language for, if you can ask to yourself, if somebody is from Bengal, he is speaking Bengali, and you're from north, like in Delhi and all, and you don't know Bengali, so how will you communicate? There will be only one language, right, to communicate English, and that's how they also did at that same time, right? So let me break it down for you. So back in the day, Queen Elizabeth I gave a special permission slip called a charter to a company called the East India Company in 1600. So these guys set up a shop in, again, Surat, Mumbai, which used to call be Bombay at the time, and Madras and Kolkata. So now these cities were coastal, which made it convenient for East India Company to trade and do business. So they started off small again, and their presence grew up over time. As they settled in, they brought along with what? Their language, which is English, right? So as the British trader mingled with the local population, they needed a way to communicate, and they decided to use English for that purpose. So it became a way for the British to interact with the Indians. Fast forward a bit, English started making its mark in India. The British realized that English could be useful for more than just trading. They began teaching in schools to the Indian elite, and they even made fancy English medium schools for those lucky few who could afford it. But things really kicked into high gear in the 19th century. The British government wanted more Indians to learn English, and so they made policies to promote it. They thought it would be handy to have Indians who could understand and work with the British rulers. So in 1835, English became the official language of the East India Company, replacing what? There was Persian, right? So Lord Macaulay, who was like a big shot at that time and played a major role in India and of course in this whole English business. So he wanted to bring Western ideas and education to India. He thought English was the way to go. So he pushed for it to be taught in schools and used as the main language of instruction. So he even wanted to train Indians to be English speaking teachers. So in 1857, right before the East India Company packed up their stuff and what they set up a university in Bombay, Calcutta and Madras. These universities was like copy of the University of London, and guess what? Language they used for teaching is English, right? You got it. So then came the British Raj. From 1858 to 1947, English started to spread like wildfire across India during this time. One reason was that more and more Indians were getting hired for the government job, and they needed to know English to work in the civil service. So by the time India got its independence and in 1947, English was the real big deal. It had become the one and only lingua franca in the country. It was the language people used to communicate with each other from different regions and backgrounds, right? To sum it up, those universities and the increasing use of English in the civil service really boosted the popularity of English in India. So by the time India became independent, English was the go-to language for people from all walks of life. It was the lingua franca, the language that everyone could understand and use to connect with each other. So that is the rise of the English language in India, guys. Now our main topic is this: important events in English education. And that's where one question is like 100% will come, right? So this is again, you have to pay attention here. If you didn't pay attention before, it's all right. But now, tell me how many of you are excited. Write in the comment and chat box quickly. Anyway, major governor. So I have just made this whole slide here based on all the governors, governor generals and governor general viceroy. So it is all in order. We'll start with Warren Hastings and we'll go on the Lord Hardinge of Bengal. This was the last one. So we'll talk about all of these and we'll just see in their rule what important event or what important bills have passed that time. So that's how I made it. So you'll remember the question sometimes comes like who was the governor general at the time when this bill or that bill was passed, right? These kind of questions come. That's why we have made this kind of slides. And here we can start with Warren Hastings, right? Little bit about this guy is that this guy was colonial big shot who wore many hats. Like he was the first governor of the presidency of Fort William, which is Bengal, right? And also the head honcho of the Supreme Council of Bengal. Basically, he was kind of the top dog and the first governor general of Bengal from 1772 to 1785. Hastings, along with Robert Clive, gets prop for laying the foundation of British Empire in India. So these guys were trailblazers, making moves that changed the course of the history. Now let me tell you, Hastings was no slacker. He was a go-getter, always organizing stuff and pushing for reforms. In the late 1700s, he even led the East India Company's force against a coalition of native states and the French. So it was like a showdown. And guess what? The British side held its ground while France lost its mojo in India. So you can imagine how strong these guys were, right? But again, Hastings faced some serious accusation of corruption in 1787. So they were all like, hey dude, you're up to some shady business, right? So they put him on trial and it dragged on for ages. Can you believe it? But in the end, he was acquitted in 1795. Hastings was a survivor and his skills couldn't be ignored. In 1814, he even became a privy councillor. The guy had some serious political clout, right? So that's the story of Warren Hastings. Now we'll move to the Asiatic. That question always come, always come in the exam. So remember that based on this particular topic, you will find one question, right? Sometime in the option you will get, so this is important. Asiatic Society of Bengal, 1784. Let me give you, let me brief it first. The Asiatic Society, back in the day, we'll start from there. Back in the day, during the rule of the British East India Company, this cool organization called the Asiatic Society was born. And it was all about studying and researching everything related to India and the surrounding regions. So there was this guy, William Jones, right, who was very smart and also was language expert, founded it in 1784 during a meeting in Calcutta. Originally, it was called the Asiatic Society, yeah, with a K, right? But hey, they changed it up a bit over the years. First, it became the Asiatic Society in 1825. Then in 1832, it got a fancier name called the Asiatic Society of Bengal. And just when you thought they were done, they decided to switch it again, and we ended up the Royal Asiatic Society of Bengal, 1936. So remember that name. So it has particular three names. So these three names that you should remember. So now let's talk about some of the cool people, involved. And it was starting with Sir William Jones, as we know, was the mastermind behind it all. So he was the British Orientalist and jurist who got everyone excited about studying Eastern stuff in the West. Jones deserved props for founding the society and getting the ball rolling in 1784. Another awesome member was Sir Charles Wilkins. So this dude was not only a typographer, right, but he was also an Orientalist. He even translated the Bhagavad Gita into English. That question come, right? This particular question always comes in the exam. So remember that. Which was this Bhagavad Gita into English was kind of big deal. And get this, he actually helped William Jones to set up the Asiatic Society of Bengal. Now that is about the Asiatic Society of Bengal, 1784. We'll move to the Lord Minto. Remember the date 1751 and 1814. So this guy, Lord Minto, from 1797 to 1814, as we know, he's a British diplomat and politician, and who ruled around, was sat in the House of Commons between 1776 to 1795. So he was a viceroy of the short-lived Anglo-Corsican England from 1793 to 1796, and went on to become Governor General of India between July 18. You don't have to pay much attention. Just remember the name Lord Minto, right? Because the question comes, the Charter Act of 1831, who ruled India at that time and who was the Governor General at that time. So the answer will be Lord Minto. So like that, they ask the question, right? So Charter Act of 1830. And what else are there? Let me tell you. So let's talk about the East India Company Act of 1830, which is also known as the Charter Act 1830. So it was like a fancy document passed by the big shot in UK Parliament. What it did was renew the special permission given to the British East India Company to rule over India. So the company got to stay in charge. But here's the thing, they couldn't have their cake and eat it too, right? The act put an end to their monopoly on trade, except for tea, opium, and the trade with China. It was basically a reflection of how powerful the British had become in India. So now here's where it gets interesting, guys. Gauri Vishwanathan, that you know, who's a smart literary critic and historian, points out two big changes that came with this act. First, the British suddenly felt responsible for educating the Indian people, and it was like they had a new mission to teach and enlighten. So that is a very important event that happened in India, especially regarding to English education, right? Second, they relaxed their grip on missionary activities. Missionaries, those folks who wanted to spread their religion belief, got a bit more freedom to do their thing. So You had the British trying to educate the Indians while also letting the missionaries go wild. So, all in all, this act marked a turning point in the relationship between India and Britain, and it was a mix of new responsibilities and a loosening of control. So the British thought they could do a better job educating the Indians, and they were slightly more chill about the missionaries doing their preaching. Right. So that is Charter Act that you should remember. Again, we have the Earl of Amherst, 1773 to 1857. He was a British diplomat and colonial administrator. He was Governor General of India between 1823 and 1828. And what happens? Ram Mohan Roy's letter to Lord, and that was the turning point in English history, right? So let's move. Let's talk about this. So Raja Ram Mohan Roy was the man back in the day, right? He was like, hey, let's make things better in India. Can you tell me what else do you know about Ram Mohan Roy in the chat box? Meanwhile, I'll just carry on what we have started. So, Raja Ram Mohan Roy co-founded the Brahmo Samaj, right? So, Brahmo Sabha in 1820, which was basically the starting point for the Brahmo Samaj or Brahma Samaj, a cool movement that aimed to bring about social and religious reform in the Indian subcontinent. Did I mention Akbar II? The Mughal emperor gave him the fancy title of Raja. Not the Akbar first, Akbar II, right? Talk about a recognition. So this guy had this Raja title before his name. So this guy had his hands in everything. He made his mark in politics, public administration, education, and religion. He was all about shaking things up and making positive changes. One of the big missions was to get rid of some messed up practices like sati, where widows were forced to burn themselves alive, and there was also child marriage. And he was like, no, we are not having any of that. So historians even call him the father of Indian Renaissance. That's some serious thing there. And Raja Ram Mohan Roy was a true trailblazer pushing for progress and reform in India. So Raja Ram Mohan Roy letter especially is addressed to Lord Amherst or Amherst, the Governor General in Council. So Roy expresses his appreciation for the government's effort in establishing a Sanskrit school in Calcutta to improve education in India. However, he criticizes the choice of focusing on Sanskrit and traditional Indian literature, which he believes is of limited practical values and hinders the spread of knowledge. Roy suggests that the funds allotted for education should be used to employ European educated individuals to teach subjects like mathematics, natural philosophy, chemistry, anatomy, and other useful sciences. He argues that promoting practical sciences would lead to genuine progress and improvement in India. Roy compares the Sanskrit system of education to the outdated schoolman system in Europe, highlighting the need for a more liberal and modern approach in India. He expresses his duty to convey these sentiments to Lord Amherst and representing the aspiration of his fellow countrymen and their gratitude for the benevolent effort of the sovereign and legislature. So that is Raja Ram Mohan Roy's letter. Remember the name, date, especially 1823, English education. That was the turning point in Indian education. Now we have Lord William Bentinck, and let's see what is there. So Lord William Bentinck, 1774-1839, his lifespan, first Governor General of India, and he was Governor of Fort William in Bengal, first Governor General. So that's what it is important. And remember why this body is important, because English Education Act of 1835, which we know as Macaulay's Minute. So these you should remember, because every time they ask question based on that. Alright, let's talk about this dude named Lord William Bentinck. He was a British soldier and was a big shot politician back in the day. And from 1828 to 1834, he was the governor of Fort William in Bengal. And get this, from 1834 to 1835, he became the first Governor General of India. Now, this guy did some cool stuff during his time in India, and he's famous for making some major social educational reforms. For example, he put an end to this horrible practice called sati, where where widows were burned alive on their husband's funeral pyre. Lord Bentinck was like, no way, this has to stop. So he passed a law called the Bengal Sati Regulation in 1829 to ban it. And guess what? The ban stuck, right? But that's not all. He also tackled some other issues, and he cracked down on Thuggies, a gang of robbers who had been causing trouble for over 450 years with the help of his right-hand guy William Henry Sleeman. And they put an end to their lawlessness. And here's another interesting thing about Lord Bentinck. Along with his buddy Thomas Babington Macaulay, he introduced English as the language of instruction in India, and that's everything started, right? Right at that point. So, and also they were like, hey, let's teach them English. It's be useful, right, for us. And so English became a big deal in the Indian education system. And just to add to his list of achievement, he also annexed, Mysore under his watch. So, yeah, Lord William Bentinck was quite the game changer during his time in India. He made some positive changes, fought against injustice, and left his mark on the country's history. That's why this dude, Lord William Bentinck, is quite important for us. So, Macaulay's Minute, English Education Act of 1835. Remember that, always. So check this out. This English Education Act of 1835 and the introduction of English as the medium of instruction, right? Lord William Bentinck made this decision. So the British Parliament was like, you gotta spend some money on education, guys, and literature in India. So Lord Bentinck was all right, let's do this. So before that, the British were kind of supporting traditional Muslim and Hindu education, and they were all about literature in Sanskrit and Persian. But things changed after this act, and from now on, they were gonna support schools teaching on a Western curriculum, and they wanted English to be the language of instruction. They were all like Western education and English, baby, right? And guess what? This move, along with other changes, made English more than just the language of the British ruler. It became one of the languages of India itself, and it started creeping into administration and even the higher law courts, replacing Persian. Now let's see what's there for us in Macaulay's Minute. A lot of things, right? We'll talk about one by one. So as we know, this was written in 1835. Remember the date. And the Minute proposed the introduction of English education in India and advocated for the replacement of traditional Indian education system with Western education. Right. Macaulay argued that British education would produce in a class of Indian who would be Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. So always remember that. Right. The Minute had a significant impact on educational policies of British India and played a crucial role in shaping the modern education system in India. Remember that Charter Act of 1813 was the first concrete step toward modern education in the country. And remember how much money they have given? This act set aside an annual sum of 1 lakh rupees to be used in educating the subject. So remember that digit, because most of the time they asked related to that also. So it was in the midst of that Macaulay landed in India in June 1834 as the president of General Committee of Public Instruction. He lampooned Indian knowledge and languages and thought them completely worthless. For instance, he said Indian literature is, like a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. He wanted to create a tool of Indians to, who would be able to serve British interest and be loyal to them. And this class would be Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in moral and intellect. Later, we had that Wood Dispatch in 1854, and it actually regularized what British effort for education in India. So that is what happened in Lord William Bentinck, Macaulay's Minute, English Education Act of 1835. That is quite important, right? Now we'll move to the Earl of Dalhousie, 1812 to 1860. You can see his photo, right? You want to see more? Look at him. But anyway, so this guy, Dalhousie, and he was a kind of, again, like big personality in British India from 1838 to 1849. So remember this name always, I mean this date. And what important thing happened? We got the Charles Wood Dispatch and also Elphinstone Report. This report, last time they have asked question based on that also. So remember that. Okay, so he was all about making things happen and getting, stuff done. First of all, this dude was all about education, and he wanted everyone in India to have a shot at learning, and not just the elite. So he introduced mass education, giving more people access to schooling, talk about leveling the playing field, right? So this guy is very important for us. Let's not forget that he founded the Public Works Department in India. Basically, he wanted to make sure there were good roads, bridges, and other infrastructure. He knew that having a solid foundation was important for the country. So this guy did a lot of things for us, right? So to his supporters, the Earl of Dalhousie was, as we know, is a legend. They saw him as this super smart Governor General who made the East India Company rule in India stronger. He set the stage for future administration and even helped prevent rebellions with his smart policies. I'm getting a fan of this guy, dude. What about you? Write in the chat box. Anyway, now we'll move to the Charles Wood Dispatch, 1854. So many things we'll talk about one by one. So there was this dude, right? Sir Charles Wood. And he was the head of the British East India Company. And he wrote this fancy official letter, also known as Wood's Dispatch, to Lord Dalhousie, who was running the show as the Governor General of India at that time. And Wood's Dispatch, which we also know as the Dispatch on Education in India, which was issued by Sir Charles Wood, remember the date, 1854. Right? And the dispatch proposed significant reform in the Indian education system and had a lasting impact on the structure and organization of education in the country. Now, what was in this letter? You want to know, right? Well, let me tell you. Well, Sir Charles had some big ideas. He was like, hey, let's make a major change when it comes to language in India. He suggested that primary schools should use the local languages, high schools should use a mix of English and local languages, which he called Anglo-Vernacular, and colleges should go full-on English mode. One of the key recommendations of Wood's dispatch was the establishment of comprehensive system of education consisting of 3 stages: primary, secondary, and higher education. So the dispatch recommended a 10-year primary stage, followed by 2-year intermediate stage, and finally 3-year degree course at the university. And I guess we follow the same recommendation, right? The recommendation laid the foundation for the 10 plus 2 plus 3. Remember this one? 10 plus 2 plus 3 system of education, which was introduced, right? And this aimed to provide a standardized structure for education across the country and ensure a smooth transition from school to higher education. It has been widely adopted in India and continues to be the predominant framework for school and colleges education. And you know what? This later particular letter had a big impact, and it played a key role in spreading the learning of English and promoting education for women in India. And it opened up a new opportunity, especially for Indians to work in the company's administrator. They created special English classes to train Indians for those jobs. But that's not all. They also put a lot more focus on vocational education and making sure women got a chance to learn too. It was a step in the right direction to empower more people through education. Right, so many things happened, guys, at that time. Okay, some key facts I would like to, because that's, as we know, it's a very important topic for us. So I'm gonna just stress a little bit more about this particular topic. I hope you're still there. Right, so Wood Dispatch, as we know, officially known as the Dispatch on Education in India, and which was introduced by Wood in 1854. In 1854, he went a dispatch to Lord Dalhousie who was the Governor General at the time, and Wood Dispatch suggests that primary school must adopt vernacular language. Through the dispatch, he also suggested that high schools use Anglo vernacular medium and that English should be the medium for college level education. Hence, Wood Dispatch is considered as Magna Carta of English education in India. It emphasized the establishment of a comprehensive system of education including primary, secondary and higher education. The dispatch recommended the role of the state in providing and funding education, the importance of vernacular language, and the creation of universities. So it also proposed the establishment of the education departments and the development of teacher training situation. Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta University were set up. Remember the date 1857. In all provinces, education departments were set up. There was one school that we also found one question based on that. Bethune School, founded by J.E.T. Bethune, was started for women's education. Agriculture Institute at Pusa, Bihar, and an engineering institute at Roorkee were also started. And British India witnessed what a rapid westernization of education system with European headmasters and principal in schools and colleges. And also we saw private Indian educator also at that time. So that is all about Wood Dispatch. Let's have a quick look on Elphinstone Report, and you would want to know what is there and the question that they have already asked based on that in that English, right? So the Elphinstone Report, we also know as the Minute of William Elphinstone, was published in 1823. And this report was a comprehensive analysis of the state of education in India, particularly in Bombay Presidency. And it highlighted the prevalence of indigenous educational institution and the need for combination of Western and Indian knowledge system. So basically the report recommended the establishment of college to provide higher education and the promotion of vernacular language alongside English education. So guys, that's all for the Earl of Lord. Dalhousie, right? Anyway, next is the Marquess of Ripon. That is also important, and you know what happened there? Hunter Commission introduced. So that's why this dude is, who is this dude? The Hunter. Anyway, he was known as the Earl of Ripon in 1859 and is the Earl de Grey and Ripon from 1859 to 1871. So he was like a British politician and Viceroy and Governor General of India who served in every Liberal cabinet between 1861 and 1908. And what is the Hunter Commission? Remember the date 1882, and also remember when it was introduced here, the Marquess of Ripon at that time. So that is also important. So let me brief it down. So this Hunter Commission, so back in the day during the British Raj, there was this thing called the Hunter Commission, right? Sounds official. Well, it was basically a bunch of people who were tasked with investigating and making a recommendation about the state of education in India. They wanted to figure out what was working and what needed fixing. So they went around visiting schools, talking to the teachers and students and gathering all sort of information. And it was like a big fact-finding mission. And also they wanted to make sure that education in India was set up to scratch. And after all the snooping around, they came up with a bunch of recommendations on how to improve the education system. Some were good, some were not so great. But hey, at least they were trying to make things better, right? And that's the story of the Hunter Mission, and just a bunch of people trying to figure out how to make education in India. And that's what it is about. Remember the date? It was established in 1882 under the chairmanship of Sir William Wilson Hunter. The commission was tasked with examining what the state of education in India and making recommendation for its improvement. The commission also recommended a focus on primary education, increased funding for education, teaching, training, and the promotion of vocational and technical education. And that Hunter Commission report emphasized the need for education that was relevant to the social and economic needs of India. And also it has the preferences, mostly that preferences was given to literate candidates for government jobs in the lower levels, along with the expansion of primary schools in background districts. District and municipal boards were entrusted with the management of primary education under the Local Self-Government Act, and the funds were separated for rural and urban areas to provide funds embarked for the rural school being pauperized by urban school. Anyway, leave that topic. Anyway, secondary schools were to be established by the private parties with funds provided by the government. Model schools fully run by the government were to be open in each district to guide such private schools. The secondary school curriculum was also revised with academic and vocational course diversified into different branches. So guys, that's all about the Hunter mission. Remember what we have to remember: this was introduced in what date, in whose rule. So that is all. Now let's move to the Lord Curzon of Kedleston. Just remember the Lord Curzon. So many things were introduced, right? Indian Universities Commission 1902, National Council of Education, Swadeshi Movement, Central Hindu Girls Education. Anyway, let's see the first one. Indian University Commission, remember the date, what all happened there, you can see. So back in 1902, when Lord Curzon was at the time very big personality, he decided to shake things up in the education department. So he put together a group called the Indian University Commission. Their job to come up with the ideas for improving universities and education in India. The commission led by a guy named Thomas Riley, and had some interesting folks on board like Syed Hussain Balgrani and Justice Gurudas Banerjee. They came up with a bunch of recommendations like changing how University Senate worked, giving more power to affiliate colleges and keeping a closer eye on those colleges. But here's the thing, not everyone was like thrilled about these recommendations. See, there was this growing sense of nationalism in British India. A bunch of colleges and higher education institutes, what these institutions had sprung up, doing their own thing and not too keen on being told what to do by the British ruler. So when the commission's recommendations came out, people saw them as an attempt to control and regulate these indigenous institutions. So it didn't sit well with the folks who were already not too happy with the British rule. So they saw it as a way to undermine their own colleges and education. Guess what? Despite all the opposition and protest, Lord Curzon went ahead and made those recommendations into law. And the Indian University Act of 1904, they called it. So that's the story of this Indian University Commission, guys. Now we'll move to the National Council of Education. So this organization, National Council of Education, which is short known as NCE, it was started by Satish Chandra Mukherjee. Remember the name, Satish Chandra Mukherjee, and some other Indian folk in Bengal way back in 1906. The goal, if you ask, to promote science and technology and push for Swadeshi industrialization. Fancy way of saying they wanted India to be self-reliant and make their own cool stuff, right? So this NCE, Bengal set up two institutions, the Bengal National College and the Bengal Technical Institute. Later on, these two merged and became Jadavpur University. So these places were buzzing with Swadeshi activities. What is this? Swadeshi? So but guess what? The government wasn't too thrilled about all this nationalistic energy, and they got all strict and started banning stuff like singing patriotic songs. They saw these institutions as hotspot of Swadeshi activities, so they wanted to keep a close eye on them. And it was a time of change and rebellion, my friend, and this NCE Bengal and its associated institution were like a spark in the Swadeshi movement. So pushing for what? Pushing for a self-sufficient India. Now we'll see that what is a Swadeshi movement. So the Swadeshi movement was, kind of very important event in the Indian independence movement. And it was all about India becoming self-sufficient, standing on its own 2 feet. People were fed up with relying on foreign goods, so they decided to promote domestic production. And the movement kicked off officially in Calcutta, 1905. At the town hall, Mahatma Gandhi himself said it was the heart and the soul of self-rule, which is a pretty intense if you ask me. Rich Indians stepped up and donated money and land for Khadi and Gram Udyog societies, and these societies focused on making clothes and also other villages industries so that each household could be self-sufficient. So the Indian National Congress saw this movement as a powerful weapon in their fight for freedom. And you know what? On August 15, 1947, when India finally gained independence, they raised a Khadi tricolor Indian flag made by hand-spun clothes. and it was like a symbol of their victory and the effort of the Swadeshi movement. Now let's talk about why the Bengal partition was like a big deal. In December 1903, the British government decided to split Bengal. They claimed it was because Bengal was too large to be administered effectively. But let's be real. The real reason was that they were scared of the protest and uprising happening there. So they thought the revolt would spread across India and they couldn't control it. So George Curzon, the Viceroy of India at that time, oversaw the partition in 1905 and he wanted to put a stop of the rebellion and regain control. But little did he know that the partition itself would cause even more outrage and fuel the fire of Swadeshi movement. Anyway, so that all happened. I just wanted to put one extra point, that's why I put. But anyway, you don't need to. What is important? Central Hindu Girls' School, and it was founded in 1905 by Dr. Aini Basant. Remember that name, very important, and part of Banaras Hindu University, and it is one of the oldest girls' school in Varanasi, and it separates campuses for nursery, primary, and main campuses. So this focuses main focus on empowering girls and providing quality education. Okay, guys, the last one. Please let it be. Don't go anywhere. It'll be over soon. So, the Lord Hardinge of Amherst, 1858-1945. He was a British diplomat and statesman who served as Viceroy and Governor General of India from 1910 to 1916. And what important thing happened? The foundation of Banaras Hindu University in 1960 and Gopal Krishna Gokhale's that Gokhale mission that we'll talk about. Gopal Krishna Gokhale. He was a very important figure during the fight for independence. He was like a mentor to Mahatma Gandhi. And Gokhale was not only a political leader but also a social reformer. He believed in the power of the Indian National Congress and founded the Servants of India Society. And he used these platforms to push for self-rule and bring about social changes. Now here's the interesting part. Gokhale was all about playing nice with the existing government. He led the moderate faction of Congress and believed in working through the system to make reforms happen. And he was also a key member of the Pune Association or the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha. They were all about representing the people and fighting for their rights. And guess what? Gokhale had this famous quote that went like, "What Bengal thinks today, India thinks tomorrow." Basically, he believed that if Bengal had good ideas, the rest of India would catch on soon enough. So Gokhale knew that if a country wants to keep up with the rest of the world, it needs to educate citizens. He was like, hey folks, we can't be illiterate and uneducated, right? So he got in touch with this fancy guy named His Highness Shivaji Rao Gaikwad of Baroda. And guess what? They had a plan. In 1906, Shivaji Rao made primary education mandatory in his territory. But Gokhale didn't stop there. He was all about spreading the education vibe. On March 16, 1911, he brought a bill to the Legislative Council, and his ideas was to have compulsory primary education in areas where the Governor General in Council set a certain percentage. So what are the bill? Let's see that. So local bodies were also to be given the right to levy taxes to meet the cost of all free and compulsory primary education. Expenditure on education was to be shared by the local bodies and the provincial government in the ratio of 1 and 2. Guardians, whose income was less than rupees 10 should not be asked to pay fees. Primary education should be made compulsory for girls, and primary education should be made compulsory for boys of the age group of 6 to 10. Right. But what happened? It got rejected. The rejection of nationalist Gopal Krishna Gokhale's bill to make primary education free and compulsory. So there was this question, once I just remember, that once they asked about this particular thing, and it was actually which statement is true. That kind of question was there, and there was that option that Gokhale's bill was accepted, and that was actually wrong, right? So these kind of question comes. So you remember all these important points that we are discussing right here. And let's find out the important key points in Gokhale's bill. There are so many things, right? But we'll move one by one. So in our next session, I will just get all the question that Nat has asked based on this particular thing, and we'll solve that too. So it's talking about Gokhale's bill. So it is like compulsory primary education for girls in certain areas, and it has fixed percentage of attendance determined by the authority, choice of local bodies to implement compulsion, and cost sharing is the ratio of 2:1. Free education for financially weaker sections and compulsory education for boys aged 6 to 10. Gokhale's bill of 1911 referred to a select committee and seeking opinions from state governments and education authority. Remember the date, bill debated in Legislative Council on this date particular 1912, and 2-day debate on the bill, which was 1912. These dates are quite important because based on that one question that I saw. So Gokhale presented powerful argument in support. Bill defeated by vote 38 to 13. Gokhale's anticipated the outcome, defeat seen as heroic one. Lack of popular demand for compulsory education, people unprepared for compulsory education, and local governments and bodies opposed it, and section of educated Indians did not support the bill. Extension of primary education on voluntary lines and grants and aid system for voluntary education. Government acknowledged the demand for mass education, and King George V donation for primary education. Resolution on education policy passed in 1930, and introduction of elementary education with nominal fee, widely introduced in the United Provinces, Punjab, Assam and Central. So this is all. We have one more that we talk foundation of. So these documents, especially this foundation of Banaras Hindu University 1960, just remember the date. So let's sum it up, and I'll just revise what we have studied so far. This unit, one question or two questions like you will definitely get. So from that itself, so if you can watch all this, that'll be really good. So we talked about the introduction, where how British end up here and what they brought with them, and we also talked about the major events like the Battle of Plassey and Battle of Buckshire, and then we went on to see the rise of the English language in India. We talked about the introduction and how English has taken shape and became the lingua franca for Indians. And there was the important events that we talked about, all in Warren Hastings. We talked about Asiatic Society of Bengal, remember the date, 1784. Then we talked about Lord Minto. Why? Because Charter Act of 1813 was introduced, remember the date. And the Earl of Amherst is why? Because important because of this Ram Mohan Roy's letter to Lord Amherst, where he talked about all the to ban the sati pratha and other stuff, right? Then we have Lord William Bentinck, which is quite important for us because of the Macaulay's Minute. Remember the date also 1835, and in Macaulay's Minute we talked about all the points there, right? And then we'll move to the Earl of Dalhousie, who is my favorite by the way, and we talked about Charles Wood Dispatch 1854. This was all introduced in the when Governor General was who? Lord Dalhousie. And of course we'll have talked about Elphinstone's report, that was known as Elphinstone Minute, right? That we also talked about. And then we moved to the Ripon Bill, where that Marquess Ripon, where the Hunter Commission was introduced, and that was played a quite significant role in Indian education. And then we talked about the Lord Curzon, where we had the Indian University Commission 1902. We talked about National Council of Education. We also talked about Swadeshi Movement and Central Hindu Girls School, right? And at the end we moved to the Lord Hardinge Penhurst. Why it is important? Because of the Gopal Krishna Gokhale's bill, right? That's what is important. And that is all, guys. We have studied everything in unit 5th, and remember 2 or 3 questions will come. It will come and you might be able to answer if you watch this. Thank you so much. This was our second topic on 100 most expected topic series that we are taking, right? Anyway, thank you so much. Bye bye and have